Welcome back to the Nomiki Show from Santa Fe, New Mexico, on the road. I think this is our 5th day on the road. Have a couple more coming, but next week we will be situated back in studio. I am excited about our next guest because I've been following him for a long time. Sasha Abramsky is a journalist. He's an author. He's the creator of the Abramsky Report, and he writes for The Nation, in which there's this article that's freaking me out that was published 10 days ago on September 7th, titled I can't even say it without freaking out. Is Trump planning a coup d'etat? Sasha, thanks for joining us. And there's enough things to worry about. Is this really on the table? Let's just start with that.
First of all, thank you for having me on. And if you're in Santa Fe, you're in one of my favorite cities in the world. So I hope you get to enjoy yourself a bit.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's a really scary prospect. I mean, basically what I've been writing about for many years now is the fact that there's an authoritarian impulse in Trump's governing style that is something antithetical to the way the democratic structure works. And as the election's gotten nearer, that's gotten worse. And the chaos around the administration has gotten worse, and the willingness to use violent language and to pander to very violent online rhetoric and very violent online groupings has gotten worse. So the answer to your question, is he planning this? I don't know what's going on in his mind. Is there a risk that things spiral badly in the coming months, both before the election and after the election? There's clearly a risk. There's clearly a cause for concern. And people across the political spectrum, and that was in my article, old guard Republicans like Charles Freed, who worked as Solicitor General for Ronald Reagan, progressive groups like MoveOn.org and Indivisible, across the political spectrum, people are worrying and strategizing about what to do if this thing goes south fast.
I'm a part of some of these groups and these conversations, and it's been jarring to see. I'm glad that everybody's organizing, but at a time when we really should be focusing at 40 days before an election on organizing and getting people out to vote, we're we're doing both things. We're talking about what do we do to protect the remnants of our republic at this point.
No, that's right. And you look at what's been going on in the last few weeks. First of all, there was this completely craven attack on the Postal Service. We're going to underfund and undermine the postal system. Trump said it very explicitly, so they can't get all the absentee ballots in. And then you have attack on in-person voting. And Trump says, well, it's going to be filled with people fraudulently voting, therefore my supporters should vote twice. And then you have Bill Barr saying, well, I'm not going to guarantee there won't be political prosecutions in the run-up to the election. And you have this completely off-the-wall suggestion yesterday that the mayor of Seattle, and presumably by extension other progressive leaders, maybe ought to be prosecuted for sedition or other charges because of their approach on the Black Lives Matters and anti-police brutality protests. So you're having this sort of ramping up of rhetoric. And then you have this idea where Trump basically says, well, the election has to be decided the night of November 3rd. Well, that's not going to happen, or it's very unlikely it's going to happen, because there are going to be tens of millions of votes that are going to be counted that came in by mail, because, as you mentioned, we're in the middle of a pandemic. And that means people are going to be voting in different ways than they would when there is no pandemic. But what Trump's basically saying is he's going to try and sort of force and strong arm elections officials to end counts prematurely and to maybe try and prematurely claim victory, and then rely on Bill Barr and the other agencies of state to really try and gum up the works legally, to make it impossible to finish and certify vote counts, all of this stuff that shouldn't be happening because it corrodes democracy. We know it shouldn't be happening. I mean, look, Jim Mattis, who's hardly a sort of left-wing radical anarchist Antifa.
Mad Dog Mattis, right?
Mad Dog Mattis issued a warning letter in the Atlantic Monthly a couple months back where he basically said, look, what Trump is doing is so divisive and dangerous, it risks destroying the American system of government. Dan Coats, the ex-director of national intelligence, again, this is not some, Antifa raving whatever. Dan Coats published an opinion piece in the New York Times today saying the future of American democracy is on the line in this election. There are some really, really big warning signs out there that people who are studying this on the inside as well as on the outside of the system are taking very, very seriously at this point.
So it is interesting to see this coalition. You mentioned former RNC chair Michael Steele, who is a contributor to MSNBC. He's by no means a lockstep like with the establishment Republican. He was pushed out of the RNC a few years ago. So it's important to highlight that. But that's always been my safety. The safety valve, I guess, has always been, the Republican senators aren't going to let this happen because, first off, they want to win the Senate. So having some sort of understanding of the vote count is important to them, too. And it just seems like there's going to be too many Republicans. As we remember Nixon being impeached, how many people started to melt away, and all of his circle of allies, they just said, it's not worth it in the end.
Yeah, well, there are a few things here. You're right, that may be the case. Though relying on the GOP to either have a sort of road to Damascus moment where they rediscover their conscience, or to sort of realize the pragmatic of going along Trump's dark road, relying on that as a safety braking mechanism to protect the republic is a little bit dangerous at this point because, if you look at what happened during impeachment, all the evidence suggested Trump was using or trying to strong arm the Ukraine in a way that wasn't legal. He got impeached, and then the Senate basically said, we don't want to listen to evidence, and they voted lockstep, with the exception of Mitt Romney, to acquit him. Time and again, Trump does something, and the Republicans sort of say, we don't know anything about that. Trump says, neo-Nazis are very nice people. And most Republican senators just say, we never heard about that. We don't know what you're talking about. Trump says the media are the enemy of the people and urges sort of physical harassment or attacks on the media. And the Republicans say, we don't know what the big deal is. So, the idea that you can rely on 53 Republican senators as the safeguard of the republic is sort of slim pickings. But, you are right that when Nixon went beyond a certain point, at the end of the day, the Republicans began peeling off. Mm-hmm. And that could happen here. You could see that the cult of the personality that has protected and cocooned Donald Trump, at the end of the day, that protection mechanism breaks down, and sort of at the 11th hour and 58th minute or whatever it might be, the Republicans decide that the future of the republic is so important that they have to break with Trump. That is possible. On the other hand, Richard Nixon didn't have Fox News and Breitbart and social media. He didn't have Facebook and the echo chamber of Twitter and all of these things that are preserving Trump's sort of sense of invulnerability. So my point was not to say all of this is preordained. My point was not to say this is definitely going to happen. My point was to say there's a real danger here, that there are enough signs afoot that the election is, has got these elements that could lead to violence, that could lead to chaos, that could lead to, contested results. There's at least enough uncertainty that anyone of good conscience, doesn't matter if you're left wing, doesn't matter if you're right wing, anyone of good conscience should be paying attention and working out what they can do to help protect this very valuable experiment, the American system of democracy.
And I should note that today is Constitution Day. So there's the big question there about preserving whatever in the Constitution that we respect in this country and do fight for as progressives. So I look to the courts right now, and I'm by no means a legal expert, but I'm very curious from your assessment of the landscape and how many judges he's been able to appoint that were approved in many cases by Democrats and Republicans, more centrist Democrats, of course. But, I mean, will it come down to the courts? And if so, in those states that we assume are going to be swing states, whether it's the Rust Belt or the Sun Belt, do we have the right mechanisms in place, at least legally, to fight back at the courts?
It's a great question, and it's one of the things I've been writing about for the last 4 or 5 years is you have these epic battles that are going on in the political system and on the streets through political protest, but you have these equally epic battles going on the courts. And we've seen this for 4 years now around immigration policy, environmental deregulation, around use of money to fund a border wall. There are numerous instances where really significant policy issues end up being played out on the courts. And, I've written probably dozens of articles at this point on the way that asylum and refugee and temporary protected status and these other parts of the immigration system basically have become legal footballs. So if the same thing happens in the election, if come election day there are 10 or 15 states where the Republicans or the Democrats for that matter decide this thing is so close, we're not going to concede, we're going to throw every legal spanner in the works that we possibly can, God only knows what happens. I mean, I'm old enough to remember the chaos in America in 2000, in November, December 2000, when Florida becomes the pivotal state and it comes down to a few hundred votes and nobody could work out exactly how to count the votes because there are these hanging chads and dimpled ballots and everything else. And it comes down to essentially an arbitrary Supreme Court decision that's so arbitrary the Supreme Court says, well, we're going to make this decision now because we need a result, but we can't consider it precedent for the future. So they basically said, we're going to ad lib this. So you could easily end up in a situation where state Supreme Courts decide we're going to ad lib it, or where the US Supreme Court says, what on earth are we going to do? We got an election, we got 10 or 15 states, we can't certify the results, we've got to come down with a result, we're just going to wing it. And nobody knows how that's going to turn out. And, that is so devastating to confidence in the electoral system, to know that at the end of the day, 100, 150 million people can cast their vote. And yet you can end up with a bunch of lawsuits being filed, not to seek clarity, but to actually obfuscate and to actually lock up the process. That will devastate confidence in the electoral system from here to come. We'll have nothing left in our faith in the ability of electoral politics to secure results.
And not to mention, and we've covered this previously on the show, we also have this electoral. I mean, that was back when we had paper ballots, which are, frankly, probably the most reliable form of casting a ballot. Now you have several states across this country swinging otherwise. We saw with California, their ballot machines malfunctioned, and they're owned by a couple of conservatives. This is mind-blowing. And this all happened after 2000 when everybody was rushing to, we need a solution, and Democrats were on board with electronic, ballot systems, and it turns out it was another grift for some Republicans to make money off of and possibly influence elections. I mean, this is... I worry so much that, what's happening in America is you're having pretty much a good chunk of the citizenry who vote wake up. And the curtain's been pulled back, not just on what it takes to get to fascism, but just the systems that were supposed to be put in place to prevent this from happening. And seeing how, behind the scenes, there are conservative elements who've been working quietly and tirelessly to work out the ballot systems, to take over courts, to get certain people appointed, and take over legislatures, of course. It's just, I don't really know how we out-organize this at this point. So that begs my question, what do we do about it? There are groups organizing, but how?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And, one of the few benefits of getting older is that you can look back and say, when I was a young journalist, and when I was a young journalist over the last 20 years, I have just repeatedly gone back to this whole idea. What do we do when electoral systems malfunction? And they seem to malfunction fairly systematically. When you have election machines that don't work reliably, when you have polling stations that are closed down, when you have voter suppression tactics designed to purge voter rolls, when you have courts siding, as they did recently with, this crazy effort to make it all but impossible to re-enfranchise ex-felons in Florida.
After
thousands, not because the public doesn't want it, the public
voted for it.
Enfranchise them. And then the court said, well, they didn't really mean it. What they meant was you have to pay absolutely every single court fine and every single associated financial thing, and then you may be eligible. And this is insanity. I mean, this makes it all but impossible to re-enfranchise people. So what do we do about it? We organize around it. Because however imperfect the electoral system is, it's still a whole bunch better than the alternative. That's a mangling of Winston Churchill's quote. But Winston Churchill once upon a time said, democracy is the worst possible system. And then he paused, except for everything else.
Exactly.
And that's kind of it. It's messy. It's ugly. It often looks like making sausage. Behind the scenes, it doesn't work very well all the time. But it is so much better than the alternative. The slide to violence, to confrontation, the dehumanizing of people through increasingly coercive language and actions. So we need to find ways to make it work. So we vote, we organize, we do non-violent, peaceful protest if need be, what John Lewis called good trouble. Yeah. We stay engaged. And I think the single biggest thing is, we're in the middle of a pandemic. There are tens of millions of people who have lost their jobs, tens of millions of people lost their healthcare access, tens of millions of people worried about their housing or schooling for their kids. There are millions of people who either have or had COVID and are suffering all the health consequences from that. And a lot of people are going to say, you know what, I got too much to worry about. I don't have time to get involved. I don't have time to vote. I don't have time to register to vote. And that's the worst possible thing, because unfortunately, all of these things are impacted by how you vote or don't vote. You want access to healthcare, you got to vote. You want rent moratoriums or other ways to protect your housing in the middle of a pandemic, you got to vote. You want expanded access to health insurance, you got to vote. You sit this one out, nothing stops except your ability to participate and shape your own destiny. So I guess the single thing I'd say, I don't know how many people are listening to this interview. Single biggest thing I'd say to those of you who are is, whatever the temptations to disengage, however much you're dispirited by the ugliness and the coarseness of the political rhetoric, however much you think, gosh, this whole thing is stacked against ordinary people, at the end of the day, your vote is your voice. And so that's what I would say. Really, really get engaged and vote and organize.
So, I mean, I live in a blue state. I live in New York, and I hear a lot of people saying, well, I'm going to vote on another line. I'm going to do something else to exercise my vote. There's also just a financial aspect of this, too. I mean, when you see a party, like, for instance, the Democratic Party in New York is by no means the most Democratic party, but the more progressives vote on the Democratic line, the more they're able to influence some of the logistics of the party, because there's representatives that can get appointed to the DNC in New York. So there's just, if you want to take over your machine, you have to be active on the outside and on the inside in taking it over. So for those who are saying things like, okay, great, I'm in a Democratic state, Biden's going to win. Why does it matter? I'm going to vote Green, I'm going to vote Independents, I'm going to vote WFP, whatever it is. And there are arguments to that too. The other side of it is, if you don't want to have these corporate Democrats, you also have to, who aren't going to approve these judges, these right-wing judges, then you have to be active in those states too. But that's a different conversation. What does a coup look like?
The language of coup, I don't think we're looking at a literal situation where Trump calls out the generals and the next day we have a junta. I think what we're looking at is...
Well, the generals are against him, right?
They may or may not be, but they've also said that they are strictly nonpartisan. And I think there's a long tradition in the US military of not getting directly involved in domestic politics. I think what we're looking at is a president who is willing to use and abuse his platform in order to gin up chaos rather than to try and tamp down chaos, and to gin up division rather than to try and tamp down division. And the idea seems to be, and it's always a struggle to work out what in holy hell is going on in his mind, but the idea seems to be that chaos and disillusionment and disengagement and suppressing votes in large numbers and making people, really uncertain about the electoral outcome is the best way to preserve power. It's not really even about election victory or defeat. It's about the preservation of power. So I don't think a coup looks like tanks rolling down the streets. I think what we're talking about is just sowing the seeds of chaos. And people who are thinking about this, or should be thinking about it, should be, we minimize the chaos. How do we preserve confidence in the electoral process? How do we preserve civic engagement that allows for a space for disagreement without that disagreement sliding into violence or sliding into, literal open confrontation? Because nobody wants that, or very few people want that. There may be some extremists, especially on the internet, who think that chaos like that is a good thing. But the vast majority of people, I don't care whether you're Republican, Democrat, or anything else, the vast majority of people in this country do not want to wake up on November 4th in a situation of civic conflict and civic unrest. So the question then is, how do we use the time that we have, knowing that Trump seems to be a person incapable of reining in his worst impulses? How do we use that time to limit the damage?
Yeah.
I don't think we're talking about a moment in time where we have absolute calm and absolute civility and, we wake up and it's all a bad dream. We want to get to a place where we limit the damage.
Right.
And that I think is what we need to be doing over the next few weeks. And if we can do that, we will avoid the worst possibilities in the period surrounding the election. So
if we can minimize the damage, I mean, there are militias being organized, not undercover anymore. I mean, these types of folks used to happen in the darkness of the internet, right? Not even the intellectual dark web, just the dark web. And now they're doing it out in the open. I saw this video. I don't buy it completely, but I've been traveling across the country and I see the signs and I see the people with the flags on their trucks of the Trump flags and the homemade like banners. I mean, it's everywhere. It's very hard to. I'm concerned about Biden's enthusiasm and his interest in making people excited, just distributing signs, for instance, or having offices available for people to make calls, whatever it is, just basic campaign stuff that, you know, may not win you an election, but at least can signify that someone's proud to vote for you. And Trump, of course, has that excitement. And he posted this video of the lines into his rally today. You know, let's forget about the fact that like having another rally is a COVID disaster, but
I didn't even know he was. Where's he having a rally?
I don't know. He posted it today that he was doing just a video of the line. I didn't pay attention to where it was, but I should be, but it was concerning to see the line. So, you know, these are folks that are openly out there talking about things that, again, used to be said quietly behind the scenes. Didn't mean that they didn't exist, but now that they see others, it's becoming more aggressive and the anger is more pronounced and it's out there. And I'm worried, I think like as you are, how that's going to manifest after the election if Trump does sow this chaos. If it's not coming from the military, you know, whether it's people who've been organizing the stuff for a long time in the shadows, or people who are just going to latch on to that. I mean, what can we do about it?
I'm desperately worried about this. And, you know, it's absolutely obvious that at least a part of the American public has got this sort of paramilitarist impulse at this point, that they think it's a good idea to weaponize. They think it's a good idea to bring arms to political protests. They think it's a good idea to talk about their political enemies as enemies, you know, as opposed to political opponents, which is really what we should be discussing our disagreements around. But this is a real problem. You know, this is a real risk that you could have not just isolated incidents of violence, and we've had that for years now, and it's been dispiriting and discouraging and, you know, frankly, horrifying to watch this slide towards violence. But there's a real risk that it goes to that next step and goes from being isolated pockets of violence to being much more systematic, semi-organized, maybe beyond semi-organized, maybe coordinated at a much higher level. And that is a catastrophe in the making, because these guys roaming around, as you said, you know, pickup trucks, Trump signs everywhere, carrying weapons, openly carrying weapons. You know, that has the makings of a disaster. We've seen that in other countries. I mean, we know it's a really, really bad thing when groups of mainly young people roam around a community looking for enemies with weapons that they're carrying. We know that really bad things happen. And you don't have to be a sort of political scholar, or, you know, you don't have to have a crystal ball to see that things have the potential to, you know, go pretty wrong pretty quickly if you have weaponry brought into the political process. And so, you know, this is a moment of such peril. And again, you know, the easy option is, I hate it all, I just want to disengage. Can't do it. There's just no room to disengage right now, because you really don't want to cede the country to people who think it's a good idea to hurt political opponents physically.
I don't know what the solution is. I hope that these groups, I mean, voting obviously is very, very, very important, but if we don't have, I mean, if the police obviously weren't on the side of progressives, who's there to make sure that they're contained and following the law and not disorderly and not instituting any sort of violence? I mean, where do we go?
Well, honestly, I think if you look at, I was a teenager in the 1980s, and I remember, first of all, in the early 80s, I remember Poland, the Solidarity movement, Lech Walesa, and so on. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And, you know, that was an incredibly oppressive regime with the very real risk that the Soviet in tanks and crushed protesters, and all of the forces were on the side of that state apparatus. But the workers in Gdansk at the shipyards basically came out non-violently, and that combination of workplace power combined with student power, combined with intellectuals writing and so on, combined with international support, made a difference. If you fast forward to 1989, you know, you can think of figures like Václav Havel, the Czech playwright, this voice of conscience for what was then Czechoslovakia. Or you could just think of the ordinary men and women who went to the Berlin Wall, the single most oppressive symbol of the Cold War. And they went to the Berlin Wall in the autumn of 1989, and they knocked the thing down. They knocked it down with chisels and hammers.
Yeah.
And there were so many people expressing peaceful, just disgust with a decayed system that they overwhelmed the state apparatus. Yeah. And, you know, you can go all over the world and look at that. Just because the forces of physical might are arrayed against you doesn't mean you pack up shop and go home. And actually, non-violent protest, whether you call it soul force protest like Martin Luther King did, or whether you call it satyagraha like Mahatma Gandhi did, non-violent protest is an immensely powerful force for change in society. And I think that's what we may need to end up sort of falling back on.
I really hope that your worst premonitions do not play out. Sasha, thank you for this piece. Thank you for highlighting it. I'd love to have you back on soon. I think there's a lot to discuss here, especially as we get closer and have, you know, probably a little bit more. Maybe we'll have more information. I don't know. Maybe.
Well, listen, I'd be delighted to come back on your show. And in the meanwhile, I hope you have at least some time to enjoy yourself in Santa Fe and in New Mexico.
I am. I already had red and green. Oh, it's delicious. Right. Thanks, Sasha.
Hey, take care. Be well.
Thanks for watching and listening to The Nomiki Show. But remember to click like and subscribe on YouTube, and please share on social media. If you're not already a patron, please join us for as low as $5 a month on patreon.com/The Nomiki Show for early and special content. That investment makes a huge difference. We are not corporate media raking in the dough. It's really you guys that are keeping us going. So please consider being a patron. And to our current patrons, thank you so much. We are incredibly grateful to you. We also now have swag. So check us out on thenomikishow.com to get your mugs, your totes, and your stickers.